Hello and welcome to Expeditionary Learning Part 1, addressing literacy instruction, research, and the Common Core shifts. We recommend that you have a place to take notes, whether it's a notebook or a piece of paper as we go along. There will be places where you'll have to stop, pause, conduct an activity, or take some notes, and then continue with this webinar. So first, let's press pause and do a quick write. What, if anything, do you already know about the Expeditionary Learning Curriculum and the design principles that went into ensuring this curriculum's alignment to high-quality literacy instruction and the Common Core state standard shifts? Please take a moment, pause this webinar, and write your answer. Thank you. Keep these ideas in mind as we move through the research around the shifts and standards. Our objective today is to understand this research and literacy instruction aligned to the literacy shifts. The driving evidence and research that informed the design of the standards is articulated through 3 shifts in ELA and literacy. The first, shift 1, is regular practice with complex text and its academic language. Second, shift 2 is reading, writing, and speaking grounded in evidence from the text, both literary and informational. And finally, shift 3, building knowledge through content-rich nonfiction. We're going to dive into the research behind each of these shifts in turn. Shift 1, regular practice with complex text and its academic language. The research shows us that the gap between complexity of college and high school is huge. In fact, research as early as 5 years ago tells us that the gap is almost 4 years quantitatively, meaning that students are not adequately prepared to tackle the complex text in front of them when they are freshmen in college. Too many students are reading at too low a level. In fact, 50% of graduates cannot read sufficiently complex text. The standards call for a staircase of increasing text complexity and access to vocabulary, beginning in elementary and all the way through high school. What this means for grades 3 to 8 is that access and experience with complex text is so important. Even if students are struggling readers or are behind, it is imperative that we give them access to rich, complex text. To highlight this, an ACT study from 2006 revealed that what students can read in terms of complexity is the greatest predictor of success for them in college. You can see from this data that as texts become more complex, the gap between what students can and cannot do widens. More interestingly, Metametrics, the company that developed L.I.F.T.ed, looked at the complexity range of text students are likely to experience in their lives. High school literature compared to college literature appears to be very much the same or close. Let's take a look at high school textbooks and college textbooks. Here we can see that gap in complexity illustrated. Military documents refer to manuals and other documents needed to access military-specific information. Personal use refers to magazines, articles, anything that we access in our daily lives, including newspapers. Entry-level occupation documents, and then of course the gold standard for college entry, the ACT and SAT. The range in L.I.F.T.ed measures here illustrates to us clearly the need for complexity so that students are prepared for both college and career. So what are the features of a complex text? I'm giving you 2 of them because these are features of the reader as well as the text. As a student struggles, complex sentences and uncommon vocabulary become more difficult for struggling readers. But I want you to pause this webinar for a moment and write down the other 8 features that you think make a text complex. Thank you for pausing. Now let's take a look at them. So you can see here that of these 10, some of them make a lot of sense. Density of information applies to every text. Letter from Birmingham Jail is dense and beautiful, but it does address things like longer paragraphs. It has many words, sentences, or paragraphs to kind of pull things together for the student. The more that these features exist in a text, the more complex it can be. That's why it's really important that we know our text very well, that we put text in front of kids that we are very familiar with, that we've read several times, that we understand what features are going to potentially give kids obstacles, and we've thought through how to deal with them. So let's talk about Shift 2 now. Shift 2 is about reading, writing, and speaking grounded in evidence from the text, both literary and informational. It seems obvious, but most college and workplace requires evidence in writing. In fact, scientists and historians spend up to 80% of their time writing and thinking about evidence-based claims. Evidence is also a major emphasis in the standards. And this actually begins in kindergarten. Students are gathering, evaluating, and presenting evidence from the text in order to better articulate their thoughts. Being able to deploy evidence is simply a hallmark of a strong reader and writer. It's also about equity. When students are able to read a text and speak confidently about evidence from that text, they're on the same level playing field as every other child in the room. They aren't preferenced because they know something that other students don't. They're preferenced for the work they are doing with that complex text. So in grades 3 to 8, this means students need to be articulating the knowledge and evidence they've gained from reading daily, informally as well as formally, whether it's quick writes, quick discussions with each other, quick looks back at the book, using notes, as well as formal essays and opportunities to write and speak to articulate what they've learned. Students must build the habit of being critical, thoughtful, evidence-based readers if they are going to be successful in college and beyond. This shift speaks to us about integrating multiple standards in service of comprehension of the text. Expeditionary learning does this through learning targets that tackle multiple standards and attend to the text as the focus of study. This is a pretty big shift educationally. Previously, we started with a single standard and chose a text to teach that standard. For example, we would choose learning main idea, and we would choose a text that helps students understand main idea. A big shift with the standards and shifts is that we start with a beautiful text, a complex text that students can learn from and dig into, and we use the standards in service of understanding the deeper meaning of that text. This is a text-first approach, allowing many standards to unfold as students explore and understand this deeply. And we know that this is important because research tells us that teaching strategies is simply not helpful. You can see from this same 2006 ACT reading study that comprehension assessments only measure one thing: whether students can read the text. This data clearly shows us that if a student can tackle main idea, they can also tackle meaning of words, conclusions, and relationships. It is complexity that differentiates access versus non-access. So what I'd like you to do now is pause and try. Can you fix these non-text dependent questions in order to make them powerful text dependent questions for our readers? Please pause, try to fix them. Thank you. I hope you came up with some great ideas. Why do you think Of Mice and Men ended the way that it did has nothing actually to do with the text? Would you have written the same ending? I mean, they may or may not, but they don't actually have to have read the text in order to tackle that question. What we want them to speak about is the powerful ending of Mice and Men, the relationship between those characters, or the themes that arise in dealing with the topic of the Great Depression and these two characters. Write about a time you were afraid. Every teacher wants to hear about this topic, but unfortunately, this has nothing to do with the text at hand. what we want them to do instead is write about fear within the context of that text. The same with this third question. Equality is indeed an important value, but we want them to write about the text, which quotes very clearly that all men are created equally. Let's talk about shift 3, building knowledge through content-rich nonfiction. Historically, students have read very little informational text in elementary and middle school. The Common Core calls for a 50-50 balance in K-5, all the way up to a 70-30 balance in 9-12. It is important to note that this is not just the responsibility of ELA teachers. All content area teachers must participate in giving students access to content-rich nonfiction. Nonfiction makes up the vast majority of required reading in adult life. In fact, in pre-Common Core classrooms nationally, up to 80% of students were reading fiction, and only 20% of reading addressed nonfiction. But in life, that number's actually switched, and up to 80% of what we read is nonfiction, while about 20% is fiction. We must begin to give students, even at the early grades, access to rich nonfiction so that they build the knowledge and vocabulary they need to tackle any text. And we know that informational text is simply harder to comprehend than narrative text, so they need more at-bats with this. In grades 3 to 8, this means attending to balance of informational text and fiction. While I mentioned that this is not the sole responsibility of the English language arts teacher, we have to attend to it. It means using the recommended text within your expeditionary learning curriculum and recommending texts that relate to those topics so that students continue to build knowledge. We also need to prepare to teach nonfiction more carefully. We need to think about those features of a complex text that might pose obstacles and help students overcome them. So why should we build knowledge? Cognitive science actually gives us 3 big reasons. The reason, number 1, is that writers assume background knowledge. For example, try it. Sally dropped her coffee during the meeting, but I jumped up just in time. Cognitive scientist Daniel Willingham has written extensively on this topic. Right? We know that writers assume background knowledge. As the reader here, in this example, you know that the coffee is hot. You would not want it spilled on you. So you can also infer that the writer was sitting next to Sally since he jumped out of the way just in time. Writers can't give us all that information. It's part of the reading process to assume knowledge going in. Reason number 2 is that readers need to resolve ambiguity. Please take a moment to read this passage. In this case, there's just not enough information to know exactly the procedure being described. Can you guess what it might be? Yeah, if I told you laundry, suddenly it becomes very, very clear. Readers need enough information and knowledge to resolve ambiguity within a text. And finally, general cultural knowledge correlates 0.5 with the reading comprehension test scores. This simply means that the more you know, the better you are likely to do on comprehension tests. Comprehension tests address, as we know, topics ranging from Burgess Shale to the snow leopard. If students have some background knowledge on these topics, they're going to do better. Basically, knowing stuff makes a huge difference in comprehension. Unfortunately, we also have a research base around what's called the Matthew effect. And we describe this through, to all those who have, more will be given, and they will have an abundance. But those who have nothing, even what they have, will be taken away. Can you think of where this quote might have come from? That's right, the Bible. It actually speaks to those who have very little, even that disappears, and that relates directly to knowledge. Readers who struggle tend to read much less than their peers who are already on level or above. And unfortunately, teachers tend to give struggling readers less to do, less complex text, less challenge, which actually increases the gap. If students who are struggling never get a chance to work with and access complex text and build that knowledge and vocabulary, they will never be able to do so. Meanwhile, students who are on or above grade level read a much higher volume and a higher level of complexity, and the gap grows and grows and grows. This is why Shift 3 is so very important. We must give students the opportunity to build knowledge and vocabulary through nonfiction, through complexity, and as Shift 2 says, basing their work and conversations and writing in evidence that they are cementing all of that knowledge in place. So let's pull all this together and take a glimpse of expeditionary learning and the shifts in action. I'm going to play a video, and as you watch this example, I'd like you to take your notebook and list any evidence of Shift 1, 2, or 3 in action. Once you've done that, at the end, we'll do a brief debrief.
Cambridge, would you mind reading our first learning target today?
I can get the gist and determine the main idea in a newspaper article about...
The text I chose for today's class was an article from the Buffalo News about a Seneca school called Faith Keepers that teaches a lot about Seneca language and culture. Look at some of the important words in there. What's an important word in this learning target? Go ahead, Julia.
Seneca.
It's Seneca. Right now, the fifth graders are studying the idea of culture through various case studies. Mainly, they're focusing in on indigenous Native American peoples of Western New York. What's another important word that we're looking at, Mr. Suppa?
Main idea.
Main idea. What is that big idea that's really important to the author? In an assessment that I've given my students recently, I would notice that they weren't picking out really important details, especially as they relate to the main idea. So this lesson was really designed to help kids to see the connection between important details and main idea. What's another important word that we're looking at, Christian?
Gist.
Gist. What is the gist? If I'm asking you to jot the gist in the margin, what are you writing about?
The important parts of the story or article.
Yeah, or what it's about, right? Today we're going to be starting a close read of a brand new text. I want you to think about all the close reading we've done before. We do a close reading process in my classroom, and it's often a multi-day process. And the first time kids read, they're reading just to get the flow of the text from the beginning to the end. This is sort of a low-stakes moment in reading. I want you just to read for the flow, all right? Show some perseverance. The second time they go back to the text, they're annotating it in several different ways in order to help them understand it. Circling important words and jotting the gist in the margins. If you're having a hard time, if this text feels really difficult to you, what is something you can do as a reader to help you to get through it and to make it a little more manageable?
Get the gist in baby steps.
Get the gist in baby steps. Take bite-sized sections, little paragraphs, right? Do I understand this paragraph? Do I understand this paragraph? And go through section by section.
I started reading the article by reading the whole thing just for the flow.
I used to do a lot more scaffolding and pre-reading activities before I let kids have a turn with the text. Something I've noticed about my students is that now that they're used to reading a text on their own for the first time and trying it out, they've shown a lot more perseverance.
And then I read it again and underlined all the important words, like traditional, school, and some of the names.
Choosing a text is always a really important process for me in teaching something like this. I was really looking for something that was an authentic text, something from a primary source, like a newspaper article, something within what they were studying, so that it had a real purpose for them in reading it. And I needed something that was complex, something that pushed them, something that taught them new vocabulary, new academic vocabulary.
After every section I read, I wrote the gist down. And I went back in the paragraph to see if I was right, and then I went to the next one.
I gave my whole class the same complex text. And one reason for this is that we found differentiation is less about text complexity and more about the amount of text the student is asked to work with. For some students, they're able to differentiate for themselves by chunking the text into smaller pieces.
I'm forming the gist for 2 paragraphs at a time. Zeman Dowdy and his wife, Sandy, started the Seneca Faith Keepers.
For other students, we actually break the text up for them so that they only see a smaller amount of text at a time and don't become overwhelmed by the idea of what they're about to read. So look back at the title, look at some of those important details you underlined, look at the gists you wrote. I want you to jot your idea for this. What do you think the main idea of this article is? And then in about 2 minutes, we're going to transition ourselves over to the carpet area to continue the second half of our lesson. We read about it, we thought about it, we wrote about it. Now we get a chance to talk about it. Jada, do you mind reading our second learning target for today?
I can explain the connection between details and the main idea in an article about the Seneca people.
You're going to choose one person near you, and you're talking about what do you think the main idea of this article is? And then what is one thing in the article, one little sentence that helped you come up with that main idea? So in the activity today, I really wanted students to build a connection between important details and the main idea. The Seneca culture is dying, so they started a school to learn the culture. So I chose the details I wanted them to work with and hung them on charts around the classroom. And students moved around in groups with Post-it notes, read the detail, and had to make a case for whether or not that detail was important and connected to the main idea. Working with complex text can be really challenging, and these kids are 10 years old, so they get really antsy. So I try to design my lessons in ways that give them time to get up and move around the room.
Yes, because like their mouths and something, and she's some language, and they won't be able to understand it. Because it's just part of their culture, right?
I try to get kids talking to each other about text as much as possible, and it allows them to understand parts of text that maybe they didn't understand on their own, but can get from up here. I want to debrief with this question. What detail did you think was important? How did it connect to the main idea?
The one about the children learn about traditional songs. One of the details I thought was important on the wall was that some of the traditions are like, for the Seneca people, are like singing and dancing. I thought that was an important detail because it like tells you the tradition.
99% of Senecans don't know how to speak the Seneca language because that's about how their culture's dying because none of them really know how to speak their own language.
Yeah, so that one really goes back to that first part of the main idea that we said, right? The Seneca culture is dying. I use a close reading process because it gives the kids predictability in how they approach a text, and they've shown themselves to be much more willing to deal with a challenge. All right, let's do one more. What's a detail? Mr. Sappa.
I did attending school is amazing.
As you can see, that's a pretty powerful example of the shifts in action in a classroom. Please pause and take a moment to refine your notes, making sure that you have examples of shift 1, complexity, shift 2, evidence, and shift 3, knowledge and vocabulary. So here we are with the shifts in action. Rather than reading through these bullets, please just pause and see how your notes compared to mine and what things maybe you noticed that I did not. I hope you're feeling much more excited about teaching expeditionary learning. As you can see, it aligns so beautifully to the shifts in standards. The L.I.F.T. literacy framework is also research-based, and it underpins L.I.F.'s approach to literacy. Expeditionary learning was chosen to support the implementation of this framework. In just a moment, you're going to have a chance to read through this framework in the handouts that you've downloaded. So finally, on the discussion board, you're going to submit the responses to the following questions. First, pause and read the literacy framework. And on the discussion board, post, what do you see presented as the most important aspects of literacy here? And then your other two questions, what does the research on the shift tell us we might need to attend to in literacy instruction? And what do the shifts mean for us as grade 3 to 8 teachers? What will we need to attend to? I want to pause and just thank you so much for your attention. And I look forward to speaking with you more for part 2.